So I want you to just imagine a scenario for a second. You're sitting on your couch, you're scrolling through your phone.
Like we all do pretty much every single night.
Right, exactly. Just
Yeah.
mindless scrolling. And you see this theoretical, somewhat academic article about society. And you think, hey, that's interesting. So you hit forward, you send it to a handful of friends online, you lock your phone, you go make some dinner, and you literally don't think about it again.
Sounds completely harmless.
Completely. But then, a few days later, you are suddenly facing criminal charges for, and I quote, picking quarrels and provoking trouble, and causing severe public order disruption.
I mean, it really sounds like the premise of some dystopian sci-fi novel.
It really does. But the question we have to ask is, how could one person, literally just pressing a button in their living room, allegedly break society? Because today, we are taking a deep dive into the fascinating case of a guy named Dr. Chen.
And we should probably clarify right up front, we aren't looking at this like your standard true crime or legal thriller.
No, not at all. This case is so much bigger than that. It serves as this ultimate collision point where a totally industrial age, mechanical legal system just slams headfirst into an internet age, complex, adaptive social network.
And the friction from that collision, it generates some incredible insights into how fragile our modern institutions might actually be.
Yeah, and our sources today are wild. We've got this really unique stack of analytical and legal defense documents. And they don't just, cite standard case law. They actually apply advanced statistical physics, network theory, and deep philosophy to deconstruct this entire situation.
Which is such a crazy way to build a legal defense.
It is. But before we jump into the actual mechanics of it all, I really want to be crystal clear about our mission here. Our goal today is not to play judge, jury, or, politician.
Right.
The original sources we're looking at, they involve some highly politically charged legal disputes. But we are strictly looking at the structural physics and the logic of this case to see what it reveals about how our modern world operates.
We aren't endorsing any specific political viewpoints here at all.
Exactly. We are just mapping the architecture of the arguments. And honestly, it's fascinating enough purely on a structural level.
It really is. And I think that starts with addressing the core accusation itself. The system claimed that forwarding this one post caused a quote-unquote severe public order disruption.
Right.
But to even evaluate if that's physically possible, we first have to understand the actual literal shape of the network he was participating in.
Well, when most people think of a social network, they imagine this relatively even mesh, right? Like a giant fishing net.
Yeah, the assumption is that everyone is connected to a few people, everyone has roughly the same voice, and information just kind of flows evenly across this flat grid.
But network science tells us that intuition is just entirely wrong.
Completely wrong. What we're actually dealing with is what the physicist Albert Laszlo Barabasi defined as scale-free networks.
Scale-free networks. Okay,
Yeah.
so how do those actually work?
So they're driven by this mechanism called preferential attachment, which is basically just a fancy way of saying, the rich get richer.
Ah, okay. The algorithm favors the big guys.
Exactly. When a new user joins a network, mathematically speaking, they are way more likely to follow an account that already has 1 million followers, rather than some random account that only has 10.
Makes sense. You follow the celebrities, the big news outlets.
Right. And over time, this creates extreme structural inequality. Like 99% of the users become what network scientists call peripheral nodes.
Peripheral nodes.
Yeah, they have very few connections and almost zero systemic influence. Meanwhile, this tiny, tiny fraction of users become these massively connected hubs.
Okay, that structural metaphor makes perfect sense. It's kind of like the airline industry, right?
Oh, that's a great way to look at it.
Yeah, like you have a tiny regional airport with maybe one runway somewhere in the middle of nowhere, and then you have massive international hubs like Atlanta or Heathrow. And if you shut down that tiny regional airport for a day, the global flight network doesn't even blink. No one notices.
Nobody notices. And Chen, in this specific digital topography, he was absolutely a regional airport. I mean, he had under 100 followers, and the documents note that most of them were basically inactive accounts.
Wow. Okay, so he's on the absolute fringe of the network.
Right. But the sources then add another really critical layer to explain the environment of this network. And they pull this one from computer science. It's called the TIP theorem.
Okay, I've actually heard of the TIP theorem in software architecture and database management. But how does a database role apply to the physical state of a global social network?
Well, it defines the absolute boundaries of what is mathematically possible in a system. So TMP stands for consistency, availability, and partition tolerance.
Consistency, availability, and partition tolerance.
Got it. And the theorem proves that in any distributed system, you can only ever have two of those three properties at the exact same time. You literally can't have all three.
Okay, to understand why, can you give me an example? Like, what does that look like in the real world?
Sure. Imagine a server split. Let's say you have a massive data center in New York and another one in Tokyo, and they're constantly syncing data.
Okay.
But then the undersea cable connecting them gets severed. Somebody drops an anchor on it or something.
Ouch. Okay.
That is a partition. And partitions are totally inevitable in the real world, right?
Right, because servers crash, the power goes out, connections drop all the time.
Exactly. So your system must always, always have partition tolerance built in because stuff breaks.
Okay, so if you must have partition tolerance, that means you're forced to choose between the remaining two. Consistency or availability.
You nailed it. Do you choose consistency, which means every single user across the globe sees the exact same information at the exact same time? Or do you choose availability, which means the system stays awake, it doesn't crash, and it keeps accepting new posts?
Well, if you choose consistency during a cable cut, you'd basically have to shut the whole global network down until the cable is fixed, right? Otherwise, the New York users and Tokyo users will start seeing different things and fall out of sync.
Right. But the internet never shuts down. It can't. So it always, always chooses availability.
It has to keep running. So by choosing availability, it mathematically has to sacrifice consistency.
Exactly. And this is huge. This means the social network is literally architected at a baseline physics level to be inconsistent.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Divergent views, fragmented information, contradictory posts, local pockets of weird noise that is not a malfunction of the internet. That's the default physical state of the system.
That is crazy. So charging this guy with creating quote-unquote disorder, I mean, that's like charging a single drop of water with causing a hurricane, when the C8P theorem literally proves the internet is designed to be a stormy ocean from the very start.
That is the perfect way to phrase it. And returning to Barabassi's scale-free network models for a second, the defense documents also cite these network robustness theories.
Okay. Robustness, meaning how tough the network is.
Yeah, specifically they use something called Cohen's threshold formula. Because the network relies so heavily on those massive hubs we talk about, the Atlantas and Heathrows, it is actually incredibly robust against random errors.
Meaning you can lose a lot of small nodes and nothing happens.
Exactly. Removing or silencing a peripheral node, or even thousands of them at once, has mathematically zero effect on the system's overall structural integrity. The network just routes around the damage and keeps going.
Okay, I hear the math. I really do. But let me push back a little here, because real life isn't always a clean equation on a whiteboard, right?
Sure.
People read things, they get angry, they text their friends off the app, they talk to their neighbors. Like, how can you mathematically prove that his specific post didn't leak out of the network and cause a genuine real-world cascade? Because we know societal disruptions do happen. Things go viral.
Well, the legal system operates on that exact intuition.
The butterfly effect.
Exactly, the butterfly flapping its wings and causing a tornado. But the sources completely dismantle that intuition using the theory of self-organized criticality, or SOC. It was developed by a physicist named Per Back.
Okay, SOC. How does that work?
SOC explains how complex systems reach these points of sudden, massive change. And Back used this really famous sand pile model to illustrate it.
A sand pile?
Yeah. Imagine you were slowly dropping sand onto a flat table, just grain by grain. For a really long time, nothing dramatic happens. The sand just forms a small pile. The grains pretty much stay exactly where they land.
Right, because the slope of the pile isn't steep enough yet to cause a slide.
Exactly. But eventually, as you keep dropping sand, the pile reaches what physicists call a critical state. The slope becomes so steep that the friction holding all those little grains together is pushed to its absolute limit.
It's maxed out.
Right. And at that specific critical moment, dropping one single tiny grain of sand can trigger a massive, catastrophic avalanche.
Okay, so a single post could trigger an avalanche if society is already at that steep critical state, right?
Yes, it is theoretically possible, but the mathematics in the defense documents prove that it absolutely did not happen in this specific case.
How can they possibly prove that after the fact?
To measure this, scientists use something called avalanche dynamics and the Golden-Watson branching process.
Okay, those are big terms.
It's actually simpler than it sounds. This model just looks at how a transmission branches out from generation to generation. The key metric they look for is the R0 value.
R naught. Wait, I recognize that from epidemiology, right? From contagious diseases.
Exactly the same concept. It represents the basic reproduction number, so the average number of new secondary transmissions caused by one initial event.
So if one person shares a post and then two of their friends share it, the R naught is 2. The cascade is growing.
Right. And if the R0 is exactly 1, the system is hovering right at that critical tipping point.
Okay, so what was Chen's R naught?
Well, if the R0 is less than 1, the system is subcritical. The math dictates that the transmission will rapidly hit a dead end and just die out. And the defense actually calculated Chen's expected R0 based on his specific network topology.
Because he was a peripheral node.
Right. Because he had under 100 mostly inactive followers, his transmission rate was mathematically estimated at a deeply subcritical 0.05.
0.05. Okay, let's unpack what an R naught of 0.05 actually means in the real world. Like, how many people is that?
Well, the formula to find the total expected size of a subcritical cascade is really simple. It's just 1 divided by 1 minus the R0.
Okay, let me do the math. 1 divided by 1 minus 0.05. That's 1 divided by 0.95, which gives you roughly 1.05.
Exactly, 1.05.
Okay, wait. The total expected reach of his post, mathematically, is 1.05 people.
Yes, including himself. Statistically speaking, his post triggers 0 secondary forwards. It reaches almost no one. The cascade is completely dead on arrival.
That is, I mean, here is where the source material gets truly shocking to me. Because the legal threshold defined for a quote-unquote severe disruption in this specific jurisdiction, it requires an event to generate 500 forwards or 5,000 views.
Right.
And the mathematical expectation of his post's reach was 1.05. We aren't just talking about a slight miscalculation by the cops here. There is a 500-fold gap between the actual physics of his network influence and the literal legal definition of the crime he was charged with.
It's massive. It reveals this profound, fundamental disconnect between the physical reality of the internet and the perception of the court. The mathematical reality proves his post literally could not have caused a societal avalanche.
But, okay, if the math makes it physically impossible for him to have caused this, the courts must know that, right? Or at least they can plainly see, looking at his account, that he's a nobody online. So what are they actually trying to achieve by mobilizing this massive, expensive legal apparatus just to prosecute him?
That is the million-dollar question. And to understand the motive, the sources actually shift away from physics, and they dive into systems philosophy.
Systems philosophy, okay.
Yeah, they bring in thinkers like Ludwig von Bertalanffy and Niklas Luhmann, and this framework explains the fundamental worldview mismatch here. You see, the judicial system, by its very design, operates on a Newtonian mechanical worldview.
Newtonian, like classical physics.
Right. It sees the world like a giant mechanical clock.
A linear universe, meaning if the clock is broken, you just have to find the single gear that snapped, and you punish or remove that specific gear to fix the clock. A directly causes B.
Exactly. But human society is not a mechanical clock. It is a complex adaptive system. It operates much more like a biological ecology.
So it's messy.
Very messy. In a complex system, causality is widely distributed. A macro-level event like, say, sudden public anxiety, economic disorder, or social unrest, it doesn't come from one gear breaking. It emerges from thousands of intersecting nonlinear factors all at once.
Like algorithms, historical context, economic pressures, lack of public trust, all bubbling up together.
Yes, but a legal system isn't built to put historical context and algorithmic pressure on trial. It can't arrest a concept. It needs a physical defendant sitting in a chair.
Wow. Okay, so what happens when society is actually having a complex crisis, but the court can only see linear causes?
Well, when the broader social system experiences genuine structural high entropy, meaning real, complex anxieties are surfacing and causing actual disorder, the closed judicial system faces an existential crisis.
Yeah.
It cannot process that distributed causality. So it experiences what systems philosophy calls functional drift.
Functional drift, meaning the institution sort of forgets its original purpose.
Exactly. Its original function is to maintain actual justice and order. But under the overwhelming pressure of all this complex social entropy that it can't fix, its primary goal slowly drifts. The new goal just becomes maintaining a specific unified narrative. The institution desperately needs to prove to itself and to the public that it is still in control of the machine.
So to prove it's in control, it needs a visible target. Since it can't arrest a complex adaptive system, it arrests a peripheral node. it arrests Chen.
Spot on. This is a textbook example of what they call reductionist scapegoating. The system cannot admit its own structural instability. It can't go on TV and say, hey, society is facing complex issues that a court fundamentally cannot solve.
Right, they'd look powerless.
So instead, it targets a visible, highly punishable individual. By crushing the peripheral node, the bureaucracy creates this illusion of control. It signals to everyone that it has found the broken gear and fixed the clock.
It's like a driver who tapes over the check engine light on their dashboard. I mean, you aren't fixing the transmission, you're literally just hiding the warning signal so you can feel like you're in control of the car again.
That's a perfect analogy.
But by ignoring the actual feedback, you are guaranteeing a catastrophic breakdown down the road.
And sociologist Nicholas Luhmann, he actually calls this phenomenon a pathological closure.
Pathological closure.
Yeah, when a system cuts itself off from negative feedback like open public debate, transparent trials, or just acknowledging its own structural issues it doesn't actually stabilize, it becomes incredibly fragile. It begins to rely on applying more and more pressure just to maintain the illusion, which only creates deeper hidden tension inside the system.
So taking over the check engine light doesn't stop the engine from melting.
Not at all.
But the defense documents show this case gets even more surreal than just scapegoating. Because the system didn't just accuse him of causing a physical disruption with his little post. They accused him of knowingly spreading falsehoods.
Right, the intent aspect.
Yeah. They essentially put his internal thoughts on trial, claiming he possessed absolute certainty that the theoretical academic articles he forwarded were lies. I mean, how do you even legally or philosophically defend your own subjective state of mind?
This is, honestly, perhaps the most intellectually thrilling part of the entire defense strategy. To counter the claim that he, quote-unquote, knowingly spread a lie, Chen utilized Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorems.
Okay, hold on. I know Gödel broke mathematics back in the 1930s, but you're going to have to walk me through the actual mechanics of how his theory works before we can apply it to a legal defense.
Fair enough. At its core, Gödel mathematically proved that there are fundamental, unavoidable limits to logic itself. And a simplified way to understand his mechanism is to look at self-referential paradoxes, like the classic statement. This statement cannot be proven true.
Okay, let me think about that. If the statement is false, that means it can be proven true, which is an immediate contradiction.
Right.
But if the statement is true, then it is mathematically unprovable because it just said it can't be proven. My brain hurts.
Exactly. It's a loop. And Gödel took that exact kind of logic and applied it to the deep foundations of mathematics. He proved that in any formal logical system that is complex enough to do basic arithmetic, there will always be true statements that cannot be proven from within the system itself.
So the system can never be perfectly closed and neat?
Right. Therefore, no complex system can be both completely comprehensive and perfectly consistent. It cannot prove its own consistency from the inside. Absolute closed-loop mathematical certainty is a literal fiction.
Okay, that is fascinating math. But how does an esoteric mathematical paradox from 1931 become a legal defense for a guy who forwarded a social media post?
He used Gödel to establish this concept of epistemic humility.
Epistemic humility.
Yeah, which is the philosophical recognition of the absolute limits of human knowledge. Remember, the articles he was forwarding were not simple empirical facts like saying it is raining outside.
Yeah, they weren't weather reports.
No, they were complex, theoretical, historical, and sociological essays.
And the law demands that the prosecution prove Chen possessed 100% absolute certainty, a completely complete and consistent mental state that those theories were a lie.
Exactly. And Chen basically argued that if human knowledge is inherently incomplete, as Gödel mathematically proved, then demanding a citizen possess absolute certainty about the truth or falsity of a complex sociological theory is demanding the mathematically impossible.
That is wild.
He essentially told the court, look, I am a skeptic. I view all complex theories as incomplete. Therefore, I am mathematically prohibited from possessing the absolute subjective certainty that this theory is a lie.
That is just a brilliant defense. He's literally saying the law is trying to criminalize a cognitive state that Gödel proved cannot even exist in the universe.
It's a total mic drop.
Yeah.
But the sources highlight this massive, glaring irony regarding the judicial system itself in this context.
Oh, I can see where this is going.
The profound irony is that the judicial system is acting exactly like the flawed formal systems that Gödel warned us about. By declaring that it can definitively rule on the absolute truth of theoretical and political ideas, the court is acting as a totally closed loop. It is pretending to be a complete and consistent system that holds a total monopoly on absolute truth.
So by demanding absolute certainty from him, the legal system is fundamentally violating the laws of mathematics. It's just an illusion of certainty being used to justify raw power.
Exactly. The defense documents argue that true justice, much like a healthy, complex, adaptive system, must remain open. It must practice epistemic humility. It has to accept that it does not possess all the answers, and it has to allow for the ongoing, messy, noisy process of seeking truth rather than just trying to legislate reality from the top down.
Man, so we have a legal system using Newtonian clockwork physics to blame a single grain of sand for an avalanche that didn't even happen, while simultaneously ignoring foundational mathematical theorems just to claim it knows the absolute truth of the universe.
Yep.
I mean, it's not just a legal battle at that point, it's a literal clash of worldviews.
It really is. We are basically watching this deep structural civilization gap play out in real time. The tools of governance simply have not evolved to match the actual reality of the governed.
And I think this connects right back to you listening to this deep dive right now, because you live your everyday life entirely in complex, non-linear systems, right? The internet you browse, the global economy you participate in, the social networks where you just talk to your friends, these are all complex, adaptive systems.
They're completely fluid, totally unpredictable, and highly interconnected.
Exactly. Yet you are governed by institutions, whether it's legal, political, bureaucratic, that still operate on this linear, mechanical, industrial age logic. They really still think they can just pull a physical lever and control the machine. And honestly, understanding this structural mismatch is so crucial for making sense of the friction, the anxiety, and the just bizarre legal events we see happening in our modern world every day.
It definitely reframes things. It frames the modern struggle not just as a political issue, but as a deep epistemological one. Like, how do we actually govern complexity with tools that were designed for simplicity?
And that leads us to a final, really provocative thought, something I want you to really mull over. In complex systems theory, diversity of thought, friction, and what systems engineers refer to as noise, these things are not bugs.
No, not at all. They are actually strictly required for a system to adapt, learn, and survive changes in its environment.
Right. Without noise, a system becomes entirely rigid. And in nature, we know that rigid systems inevitably shatter when the environment shifts. A system that violently attempts to outlaw small avalanches basically just guarantees a massive one later on.
The tension has to go somewhere.
Exactly. So if rigid legal and political systems continue to treat this essential everyday noise, like just some peripheral node forwarding an academic article on their couch, as a crime that must be punished, what actually happens? Will the ultimate catastrophic avalanche really come from the edge of the network, from the people just talking? Or will it happen because the rigid, inflexible center finally snaps under the overwhelming pressure of a complex reality it stubbornly refuses to understand?
It's a terrifying question.
It is. Definitely something to think about the next time you hit forward.